It may feel like the distant past now, but it was only 3 days ago that the U.S. government was on the brink of disaster. The country was hanging on a ledge as it neared closer and closer to defaulting on its trillion-dollar debt, a default that could have triggered an economic collapse and reinvigorated a global financial meltdown. But despite the stakes being so high, lawmakers in Washington seemed more concerned about serving their political agendas, instead using the political deadlock to force each other to make tough decisions. It's a crisis-driven approach that President Obama called attention to earlier this week.
I want to thank the leadership for coming together and getting this done. Hopefully next time it won't be in the 11th hour. One of the things that I said throughout this process is we've got to get out of the habit of governing by crisis.
But it goes beyond just a poor strategy to get things done in Washington. This brinkmanship is starting to have a real effect on the economy. This according to a new study called The Cost of Crisis-Driven Fiscal Policy. The study, commissioned by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, shows that this reliance on crisis-driven governing just since 2010 has cost the U.S. 900,000 jobs. So to talk about how this is possible and what these perpetual impasses are doing to disrupt the economy, I spoke earlier with Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I first asked him about the process by which political deadlock translates into a loss of so many jobs.
I think the basic problem has to do with how to handle an economic system that isn't working for the majority of the American people anymore. I mean, the basic issue, the long-term issue, is that American large businesses have decided they can make more money by moving out of the United States, taking advantage of lower wages in China, in India, in Brazil, in Nigeria, all over what we used to call the third world. And basically, they've left or they are in the process of leaving. That leaves the United States with an enormous problem. There aren't enough jobs. The people who lost their jobs crowd into the job possibilities that remain, driving down the wages there. And we have a fundamental economic crisis that requires a massive response if there's any hope of getting out of it. The only agency in the United States that can deal with that problem, that has the money, that has the reach, that has the broad scope for action, is the United States government. But the fear of the business community is that if the government takes this problem under its wing and goes after it, that either they will be taxed to pay for the solution, or that the solution will involve taking power and decision-making away from big corporations and maybe even limiting their freedom to leave the country without taking care of the mess they leave behind. They're determined not to let that happen. They work through the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party, to stymie the government, to get it into gridlock so it can't move in the directions they're fearful about. That's our problem.
And Richard, people talk about Washington being more divided than ever at this point, but it seems like gridlock has always existed. Can you put this into historical context for us? Is this government more polarized than ever before?
Not at all. It's only polarized around particular issues, and it can swing into action when its interests are allied with those of business. Let me give you the clearest example. In the last 4 months of 2008, our economy came this close to complete collapse. That's the period of time beginning with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers in New York and the cascade of disaster. In comes the Congress of the United States, Republicans and Democrats, mostly the same people who are sitting there now. And in a matter of weeks, they swung into action and they pumped trillions of dollars, with a T, trillions into the United States, in a stimulus program, in a bailout program. They brought in the Federal Reserve. Everybody worked together. There was no dispute. There was no fighting. There was no gridlock. All the trouble came later, after you bailed out the big banks, the big corporations, saved General Motors, the whole story. Suddenly, when it came time to maybe taxing the beneficiaries of all those bailouts so that the government could help the average American, then we had gridlock. Then we had fighting. No, 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 we don't have a gridlocked Congress when it comes to helping the people who call the shots. We only have gridlock when the question is, what do you do for the people who've suffered 5 years of this crisis, still are unemployed, find their children having to borrow unquestionable amounts of money to go to school and all the rest? Then, when it comes to solving the people's problems, then we hear about gridlock and division. No, no, no. The issues go much deeper than that.
And Richard, I think the scary thing is that we know that we'll be revisiting these same contentious issues in another 4 months when the debt ceiling returns. Lawmakers aren't necessarily fixing the underlying problems here, but rather they're finding temporary solutions to them. So how difficult is it to actually recover from the damage that's been done?
I don't see any change in the basic contours of the U.S. economy for years into the future. And I noticed that one of the most wise commentators, Stephen Roach, used to work for many years at Morgan Stanley Bank, has said the same thing in recent days. We're not doing anything to solve this economic problem. We're patching it over with a little bit of fix it here and there. We've made our commitment to bail out the big corporations. We thought as a nation that the bailout would lead the banks to lend money to businesses and people so we could recoup our economy. They did no such thing. The big corporations keep leaving. We have a political system that is subservient to the people who run our economic system. And the truth of it is, unless and until we face that we're dealing with the people who run our big corporations and we have to change how they work and the decisions they make, so long as we don't face that, we'll be dealing with their puppets, their tools in the United States Congress and the White House too, and they will give us lots of political theater, lots of raw material for news stories, but they will not give us real movement or decision making because they're held in check by subservience to the larger interests that control them.
Sure. And speaking of corporations, in response to everything that just happened politically, one venture capitalist in Silicon Valley said this. He said, if companies shut down, the stock market would collapse. If the government shuts down, nothing happens and we all move on because it just doesn't matter. What's your take on that?
Well, I think there's a point to it all. I mean, it matters. You know, there were hundreds of thousands of people who lost their jobs for a few days. There were businesses that therefore had no customers. There were all kinds of hardships when the government doesn't do the thousands of things we needed to do. So I wouldn't underestimate that importance. I wouldn't also underestimate the enormous significance for the rest of the world that used to look upon the United States as the bastion of capitalist calm, of capitalist functionality, a safe place to invest your money. The United States is looking less and less like a society that can control itself and more like a society beginning to fall apart. The long-run effects of that are enormous. But I do agree with the Silicon Valley fellow that you quoted, that the real issue is how corporations are making decisions, since we have an economy in which we allow the tiny number of people that control the biggest corporations to make decisions we all have to live with, but which we are not allowed, either directly or through our government, to have much influence over.
Absolutely.
That's an untenable situation.
I want to jump in there because I want to ask you a very important question, which is how do we even begin to break this vicious cycle that has really come to define this way that Washington is operating? Will it take an overhaul of our political system, our economic system, or both?
I think first and foremost the focus should be on our economic system. We should stop this strange American desire to blame our economic problems on our politicians. You know, the biggest problem of the last 6 years has been unemployment. Millions and millions of people were fired from their jobs. You know who fired them? Private capitalist employers, not government officials. In the first line of criticism and anger ought to be focused focused where it belongs, on the decision makers in our corporations who decided to move out of the country, to lay off American workers, and let's go from there. We don't do that. We leap over the corporations who fire us to blame the politicians who had relatively little to do with it. That's where we got to start. And what do I mean? We have to bite the bullet. We have to face the hard reality. We allow an economic system to exist which is flagrantly undemocratic. In most corporations, a tiny handful of people, major shareholders, a dozen, the board of directors, another dozen, make all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. We all, the mass of people who work in all these businesses, making this economy go, we live with the results that a tiny group of people make. Do we vote them in? No. Do we have democratic accountability for their actions? No. They do what's profitable for them. They give themselves enormous salaries, they pay themselves the dividends, they decide to move to China. We live with the results, they make the decisions. You know, we had the American Revolution not to have a King of England do that for us. And we don't need a few corporate executives, overpaid as they are, to play the role of kings in our modern time. We have to face that question now to become a nation that can rule its own destiny, just like we had to years ago vis-a-vis England. And I think until we face that, we're going to look at all of these irritating theatrics in Washington and be worried about them while the real problem goes unaddressed.
Well, certainly a lot more to come, and we'll definitely have to have you back on because this is the news that doesn't stop giving. Richard Wolff, Professor Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for the opportunity.